At 12:42 a.m. on March 8, 2014, Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 taxied down runway 32, right at Kuala Lumpur International Airport, its twin Rolls-Royce engines spooling up for what should have been a routine 6-hour journey to Beijing. The Boeing 777, registration 9 Mike Romeo Oscar, carried 239 souls into a humid Malaysian night that would swallow them whole. This is the story of aviation's greatest unsolved mystery. A modern airliner that didn't just crash, but vanished so completely, it rewrote the rules of what we thought was possible in our surveilled, satellite-tracked world. Captain Zaharia Ahmad Shah, 53 years old with 18,000 flight hours, guided the aircraft through its initial climb as First Officer Farik Abdul Hamid, just 27, worked through standard departure procedures. The flight deck hummed with familiar sounds, the whisper of conditioned air, the soft electronic chimes of the flight management system, the steady thrum of engines pushing them northeast toward the South China Sea. Through the cockpit windows, the lights of Kuala Lumpur fell away into darkness, replaced by the infinite black of ocean below. At 1:07 a.m., the Aircraft Communications Addressing and Reporting System ACARS transmitted its routine position and status update to ground stations. Fuel quantity, 43,800 kilograms. All systems normal. The automated message disappeared into the digital ether, carrying no hint of the chaos about to unfold. 12 minutes later, at 1:19 a.m., Kuala Lumpur Air Traffic Control issued their standard handoff instruction. Malaysian 370, contact Ho Chi Minh 120.9. The response came back crisp and professional. First Officer Hamid's voice carrying no trace of distress. Good night, Malaysian 370. Those 7 words would become the aircraft's epitaph, the last coherent transmission ever received from Flight 370. What happened next defied every protocol, every assumption, every carefully constructed safeguard of modern aviation. At 1:21:13 a.m., the aircraft's Mode S transponder, the device that broadcasts the plane's identity, altitude, and position to air traffic control, simply stopped transmitting. Not gradually, not with warning signals or distress codes. It ceased, as if someone had reached over and flicked a switch. The secondary surveillance radar at Ho Chi Minh Air Traffic Control showed the aircraft's last blip at approximately 1:21 a.m., roughly 37 minutes after takeoff. The Boeing 777 had been flying exactly where it was supposed to be, following its filed route toward waypoint Aigeri on the boundary between Malaysian and Vietnamese airspace. Then, it was gone. But here's where the impossible became undeniable. Malaysian military radar, operating independently from civilian air traffic control systems, painted a different picture entirely. Their primary radar screens showed something that shouldn't have existed. A target making a sharp westward turn, abandoning its northeast course to Beijing, and instead tracking back across the Malay Peninsula. The unidentified aircraft flew over land it had no business flying over, following a path that would take it toward the Strait of Malacca. The target moved with purpose, maintaining altitude and speed as it crossed Malaysia from east to west. This wasn't the erratic flight path of a crippled aircraft or the chaotic signatures of an in-flight emergency. The radar returns showed controlled flight, deliberate navigation, someone or something guiding 9 Mike Romeo Oscar on a course that made no sense to anyone watching from the ground. At 2:22 a.m., more than an hour after its last civilian radio contact, the mysterious target finally faded from Malaysian military radar coverage northwest of Penang Island. The Boeing 777 had vanished completely, leaving behind only questions that would torment investigators for years to come. But even as ground controllers frantically worked their radios and radar screens showed empty sky, Flight 370 wasn't finished with its impossible journey. Unknown to anyone at the time, the aircraft's satellite communication system, which had gone silent along with everything else, suddenly came back to life at 2:25 a.m., automatically reconnecting with the global Inmarsat network, like a ghost reaching back from the void. How does a modern airliner simply disappear in one of the most monitored airspaces on Earth, only to resurface on satellite networks hundreds of miles from where it should have been? Before we dive deeper into this mystery, let me ask, where are you watching from and what time is it where you are? Drop a comment below. And if this story has you hooked already, smash that like button and hit subscribe. We're just getting started. The satellite handshakes that followed would rewrite everything we thought we knew about Flight 370's final hours, revealing a journey so bizarre it would spawn 1,000 theories and launch the most expensive search in aviation history. 7 automated handshakes pulse through space at precise intervals, each one a digital heartbeat from an aircraft that officially no longer existed. These weren't voice transmissions or deliberate communications. They were the electronic equivalent of a dying man's pulse, measured by satellites 22,000 miles above the Indian Ocean. What the Inmarsat network recorded that night would become the most analyzed dataset in aviation history, the only remaining thread connecting Flight 370 to the living world. The satellite communication system aboard 9 Mike Romeo Oscar operated independently of the aircraft's other communication equipment, designed as a backup when conventional radio frequencies failed. At 2:25 a.m., roughly an hour after every other system had gone silent, the SATCOM unit performed what engineers call a log-on request, essentially announcing its presence to the global network after an unexplained period of disconnection. This wasn't supposed to happen. Under normal circumstances, the SATCOM system would remain continuously connected throughout flight, exchanging routine data with ground stations without interruption. The fact that it needed to log back on suggested something had deliberately or accidentally severed its power supply, then restored it. But what could cause such a specific, targeted system failure while leaving the aircraft's basic flight controls operational? The handshakes that followed painted a picture of an aircraft flying deeper into the unknown. Each automated exchange carried subtle clues embedded in signal timing and frequency shifts, data that would later allow investigators to calculate the Boeing's approximate distance from the satellite at each point. The analysis revealed something extraordinary. Flight 370 had continued flying for more than 6 hours after its last radio contact, following a southern trajectory into one of the most remote regions on Earth. At 7:13 a.m., more than 6 hours into this phantom flight, ground controllers attempted something desperate. They placed a satellite telephone call directly to the cockpit, hoping against hope that someone aboard the missing aircraft might answer. The call connected successfully. The phone system was operational, but nobody picked up. The unanswered ringtone echoed through empty frequencies, a haunting reminder that something was terribly, inexplicably wrong. Adding another layer to the mystery, investigators later discovered that First Officer Farik Abdul Hamid's personal mobile phone had briefly registered on a cell tower in Penang at 1:52 and 27 seconds a.m. The connection lasted only moments, not long enough for a completed call, but it provided crucial confirmation that the aircraft had indeed passed over Penang Island, exactly where military radar suggested. What made this discovery particularly unsettling was the timing. The phone registered on the tower right around the time the aircraft should have been flying at cruising altitude over Penang, suggesting the Boeing might have descended low enough for ground-based cellular networks to detect the device. The final satellite handshake occurred at 8:19 a.m., nearly 8 hours after takeoff. This last digital exchange was different from the others. It was initiated by the aircraft itself rather than by ground stations, a technical detail that would prove crucial to understanding Flight 370's final moments. Engineers determined that this type of handshake typically occurs when an aircraft's primary electrical systems fail and the auxiliary power unit automatically starts, attempting to restore power to critical systems. The implications were chilling. The evidence suggested that at 8:19 a.m., both of the Boeing 777's engines had flamed out simultaneously, most likely due to fuel exhaustion. As the aircraft began its final descent into the southern Indian Ocean, the auxiliary power unit had kicked in automatically, sending one last electronic pulse into space, a digital death rattle from an aircraft that had traveled farther than anyone thought possible. Weather conditions that night had been nearly perfect. Satellite imagery showed no significant clouds or storms along the aircraft's last known route, with light winds from the northeast at cruising altitude. Whatever happened to Flight 370, it hadn't been caused by meteorological factors. The clear skies that should have made for a routine flight had instead become the backdrop for aviation's most baffling disappearance. But if the satellite data revealed where the aircraft had gone, it raised an even more disturbing question. Who or what had been controlling it during those 6 hours of phantom flight through the darkness? The handshakes had traced an impossible journey from the busy shipping lanes of Southeast Asia to the vast emptiness of the southern Indian Ocean, but they couldn't explain how or why a routine commercial flight had transformed into something that defied every rule of modern aviation. Dawn broke over the South China Sea on March 8, 2014, revealing an ocean surface that should have been scattered with debris, oil slicks, and the unmistakable signs of aviation disaster. Instead, search crews found nothing but endless blue water reflecting an empty sky. The disappearance of 239 human beings aboard a modern airliner had just triggered the largest multinational search and rescue operation in aviation history, a desperate hunt across several million square kilometers of ocean for answers that seemed to exist nowhere on Earth. Within hours of Flight 370's failure to arrive in Beijing, aircraft from multiple nations began crisscrossing the waters between Malaysia and Vietnam, their crews scanning the surface for any trace of the missing Boeing. Malaysian Navy vessels, Vietnamese Coast Guard cutters, and civilian merchant ships diverted from their routes to join the search, creating a floating armada focused on a single, impossible question. How do you lose a 200-foot-long aircraft in the modern world? The passengers aboard 9 Mike Romeo Oscar represented a cross-section of humanity united only by their choice of flight that night. 153 were Chinese nationals, business travelers, tourists, families returning home. 50 were Malaysian, including the 12 crew members who had reported for duty expecting nothing more challenging than monitoring autopilot systems and serving meals during a routine red-eye flight. Among the passengers were 2 Austrian nationals traveling on stolen passports, a detail that would initially fuel terrorism theories before investigators determined the men were Iranian asylum seekers with no connection to extremist groups. Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah had logged more than 18,000 flight hours over his career, including extensive experience on the Boeing 777. His social media presence revealed a man passionate about aviation, politics, and technology, someone who built elaborate flight simulators in his home and posted videos demonstrating complex flying techniques. First Officer Farik Abdul Hamid was younger, less experienced, but fully qualified and in the middle of what should have been a normal transition to flying as a first officer on the 777 after years on smaller aircraft. These weren't the profiles of men preparing for a suicidal mission or catastrophic breakdown. They were professional aviators going about their jobs, which made the aircraft's subsequent behavior all the more mystifying. As search aircraft traced patterns over the initially suspected crash zone, investigators began examining the Boeing's cargo manifest for clues. The aircraft carried approximately 220 kilograms of lithium-ion batteries, along with 2,200 kilograms of associated accessories, properly packaged according to International Civil Aviation Organization guidelines, and cleared through multiple inspection checkpoints before loading. Also aboard were 4,500 kilograms of fresh mangosteens, a Southeast Asian fruit prized in Chinese markets. The cargo had passed every safety check, but lithium batteries had been involved in aircraft incidents before, raising questions about whether an in-flight fire might have triggered the chain of events. The search operation quickly revealed just how vast and unforgiving the ocean could be. Professional search crews, equipped with the most sophisticated detection equipment available, found themselves looking for specific pieces of debris across an area larger than many countries. Every floating object became a potential clue: shipping containers, fishing nets, natural debris from storms, but none of it belonged to Flight 370. Military radar operators from multiple countries began sharing their data, slowly reconstructing the aircraft's impossible journey across Malaysia and into the Strait of Malacca. The picture that emerged defied standard explanations. This hadn't been a gradual system failure or pilot struggling with an emergency. Someone or something had deliberately turned the aircraft away from its intended route, switched off its identifying transponder, and guided it on a path that avoided the busiest commercial air routes. As the search expanded westward, following the radar evidence, a disturbing realization began to take hold among investigators. They weren't just looking for wreckage anymore. They were hunting for an aircraft that had seemingly vanished on purpose, flown by unknown hands toward an unknown destination for unknown reasons. The families waiting in Beijing and Kuala Lumpur airports faced an agony unique in the modern era. Their loved ones hadn't simply died in an accident. They had disappeared into a void that offered no answers, no closure, no explanation that made sense in a world where every commercial flight was supposed to be tracked from takeoff to landing. But as search crews continued their methodical grid patterns across thousands of square miles of empty ocean, the satellite data was quietly revealing something that would change everything. Flight 370 hadn't crashed where anyone was looking. The Boeing 777 had flown much, much farther into the darkness than anyone had imagined possible. How do you search for something when you don't know where it went, how it got there, or why it left in the first place? 3 months after Flight 370 vanished, the surface search operation officially ended, leaving behind a haunting truth. In 52 days of intensive searching across several million square kilometers of ocean, the largest multinational rescue effort in history had found absolutely nothing. The shift from rescue to recovery, from hope to investigation, marked the beginning of humanity's most ambitious attempt to map and search the deep ocean floor, a technological odyssey that would push the boundaries of underwater exploration and consume hundreds of millions of dollars in the master's process. The breakthrough that redirected the entire search effort came from an unlikely source: the meticulous analysis of those 7 satellite handshakes by engineers at Inmarsat and Britain's Air Accidents Investigation Branch. Using subtle variations in signal frequency and timing data, originally designed for billing purposes rather than aircraft tracking, investigators performed mathematical calculations that bordered on the miraculous. They determined that Flight 370's final satellite contact had occurred somewhere along what became known as the 7th Arc, a curved line stretching across the southern Indian Ocean, approximately 1,600 nautical miles west of Perth, Australia. This wasn't just any ocean. The search zone encompassed some of the most remote and treacherous waters on Earth, where depths plunge to more than 6,000 meters, and underwater mountain ranges create a landscape more alien than the surface of Mars. The southern Indian Ocean is a place where massive waves generated by Antarctic storms travel thousands of miles unimpeded, where the seafloor had never been properly mapped, and where the nearest land was thousands of kilometers away in any direction. In May 2014, the search strategy underwent a fundamental transformation. What had begun as a surface operation, looking for floating debris, became something unprecedented: a systematic attempt to map and visually inspect vast areas of deep ocean floor using the most sophisticated underwater technology available. The Australian Transport Safety Bureau, working with international partners, committed to what would become the most expensive search in aviation history. The technical challenges were staggering. Search vessels deployed autonomous underwater vehicles equipped with side-scan sonar, capable of creating detailed images of the seafloor from thousands of meters below the surface. These robot submarines, each worth millions of dollars, worked in conditions that would instantly crush human divers, navigating by GPS signals that couldn't penetrate seawater, and communicating through acoustic modems that function more like underwater telegraph systems than modern data networks. Between 2014 and 2017, search teams methodically scanned 120,000 square kilometers of ocean floor, an area roughly the size of England. The sonar images revealed an underwater world of extraordinary complexity: ancient volcanic formations, deep-sea coral gardens, shipwrecks from previous centuries, and geological features that had never been seen by human eyes. But they found no trace of 9 Mike Romeo Oscar. Each day of searching cost hundreds of thousands of dollars and required perfect coordination between surface vessels, underwater vehicles, and satellite navigation systems operating at the edge of their technical capabilities. The autonomous underwater vehicles worked in systematic patterns, like robotic lawn mowers cutting precise grid lines across the seafloor, their sonar pulses painting detailed pictures of terrain that had remained hidden since the ocean formed. Weather in the southern Indian Ocean proved to be another formidable enemy. The search zone lay in what sailors call the Roaring Forties latitudes, known for some of the most violent seas on the planet. Massive storms regularly forced search vessels to retreat to safer waters, sometimes for weeks at a time, while waves exceeding 15 meters made deployment of underwater vehicles impossible. The ocean itself seemed determined to guard its secrets. As the months turned to years, the systematic search revealed just how little humanity understood about the deep ocean. The seafloor topography bore no resemblance to satellite-based estimates, with underwater mountains and valleys creating acoustic shadows that could hide aircraft wreckage from even the most sophisticated sonar systems. Search crews realized they weren't just looking for debris. They were essentially conducting the first comprehensive survey of a region of Earth that remained as unexplored as any distant planet. In early 2018, Ocean Infinity, a private marine exploration company, offered to continue the search under unprecedented terms. They would deploy multiple autonomous underwater vehicles simultaneously and charge nothing unless they found the aircraft. Their no-find, no-fee contract represented a final gamble on technology and determination, adding another 112,000 square kilometers to the search area. The Ocean Infinity operation pushed underwater search technology to its absolute limits, deploying 8 autonomous vehicles at once to cover more seafloor in weeks than previous searches had managed in years. Their advanced sonar systems could distinguish objects as small as aircraft engines from thousands of meters away, creating 3-dimensional maps of the ocean floor with extraordinary precision. Yet even with this technological tour de force, the search yielded the same result: nothing. After scanning more than 230,000 square kilometers of ocean floor, an area larger than the United Kingdom, the most sophisticated underwater search in human history had failed to locate any trace of the missing Boeing 777. But while the deep ocean had kept its primary secret, the vast emptiness of the search results was beginning to tell its own story. Flight 370 had gone somewhere else entirely, somewhere that none of the mathematical models, satellite calculations, or drift analyses had predicted. On July 29, 2015, Johnny Big A was cleaning the rocky shoreline of San Andre Beach on Reunion Island when he spotted something that would rewrite the entire MH370 investigation: a barnacle-encrusted piece of aircraft wing lying among the usual debris of bottles, fishing nets, and driftwood that washed up on this remote French territory in the western Indian Ocean. After 17 months of the most expensive underwater search in history, finding nothing, the ocean had finally surrendered its first piece of physical evidence. But the message it carried was more cryptic than anyone had hoped. The wing component, identified as a right flaperon from a Boeing 777, bore the serial number that conclusively linked it to 9 Mike Romeo Oscar. French investigators examining the 2-meter-long piece found it covered in marine organisms that told the story of a long journey across thousands of miles of ocean. The barnacles and other sea life attached to the flaperon provided biological evidence of the wing's path through different water temperatures and current systems, confirming that debris from Flight 370 had indeed reached the western Indian Ocean. But the flaperon's condition raised disturbing new questions about the aircraft's final moments. Detailed analysis of the damage patterns revealed that the wing component had likely separated from the aircraft, while the right outboard flap was in a retracted position, the normal configuration for cruising flight, rather than an emergency landing attempt. The metal showed signs of relatively high energy separation, suggesting the aircraft had hit the ocean's surface with considerable force rather than attempting a controlled ditching. More debris would follow, washing up on beaches across the western Indian Ocean over the following months. A left outboard flap section found on the Tanzanian coast, pieces of interior paneling discovered in Madagascar, a right aileron fragment recovered from Pemba Island. Each piece confirmed that Flight 370 had indeed ended somewhere in the southern Indian Ocean, but none provided clear answers about how or why. The debris pattern itself became another puzzle within the larger mystery. Ocean current modeling and drift analysis suggested the fragments had been floating for months or even years before reaching shore, carried by the complex circulation patterns that govern water movement across the Indian Ocean basin. But the distribution of debris didn't match any of the crash locations proposed by the extensive underwater search efforts, raising questions about whether investigators had been looking in the wrong place all along. Perhaps most troubling of all, the aircraft's emergency locating equipment, designed specifically to help rescuers find crashed aircraft, had completely failed. The flight data recorder's underwater locator beacon, which should have transmitted acoustic signals for 30 days after impact, had been rendered useless by an expired battery that had gone unnoticed during routine maintenance. The battery had expired in December 2012, more than a year before the aircraft disappeared, meaning the most crucial piece of rescue equipment aboard Flight 370 had been non-functional when it was needed most. Even more disturbing, none of the aircraft's emergency locator transmitters had sent any signals after the disappearance. These devices, designed to automatically activate upon impact and broadcast distress signals to rescue satellites, are considered among the most reliable safety systems in aviation. Their complete silence suggested either catastrophic damage that destroyed the transmitters instantly, or conditions so severe that the electronic systems never had a chance to function. The forensic analysis of the recovered debris pieces revealed something else that would haunt investigators. The fragments showed evidence of being in the water for extended periods, with marine growth and damage patterns consistent with months of ocean exposure. This physical evidence confirmed what the satellite data had suggested. Flight 370 had continued flying for hours after its last radio contact, ultimately crashing in a remote area where currents would carry debris thousands of miles before it reached any coastline. As more pieces of the aircraft washed ashore across the western Indian Ocean, each discovery brought a mixture of vindication and frustration. The debris confirmed that investigators had been right about the general crash location somewhere in the southern Indian Ocean, but wrong about the specific coordinates where the main wreckage lay on the seafloor. The barnacles told their own story, their growth patterns and species composition, providing clues about water temperatures and current systems the debris had encountered during its long journey to shore. Marine biologists studying the organisms found evidence that the wing components had drifted through multiple climate zones, confirming the complex path debris had taken across one of the world's largest ocean basins. But for every question the physical evidence answered, it seemed to raise two more. Why had an aircraft that appeared to be under some form of control for hours after its communications failed ultimately crashed with such force? What had happened during those missing hours between the last satellite handshake and the moment of impact? The debris had proven that Flight 370 had indeed met its end in the southern Indian Ocean, but the fragments washing up on distant beaches carried no information about the human drama that had unfolded aboard the aircraft during its final hours. The ocean had returned pieces of the Boeing 777, but it had kept the most important secrets buried in the abyss: the flight recorders that could reveal what had happened in the cockpit, the voices and data that might finally explain how a routine flight to Beijing had become aviation's greatest mystery. 4 years after Flight 370's disappearance, Malaysian investigators released their final report, 500 pages of meticulous analysis that concluded with a confession of failure that would have been unthinkable in the early days of aviation investigation. They could not determine what had caused the loss of 239 lives. The admission marked the end of the most comprehensive aviation investigation in history and the beginning of an era where theories would multiply in the absence of definitive answers, each hypothesis carrying fragments of truth, but none capable of explaining the complete sequence of events that had unfolded in the darkness over the South China Sea. The Malaysian Ministry of Transport's 2018 Safety Investigation Report, submitted to the International Civil Aviation Organization under Annex 13 protocols, represented thousands of hours of analysis by investigators from multiple countries. Yet its central finding was as stark as it was unsatisfying. The evidence was consistent with manual intervention in the aircraft systems, but the report could not determine who had been responsible or why such intervention had occurred. The investigators had ruled out mechanical failure as a primary cause. The Boeing 777's maintenance records were exemplary, its airworthiness certificate valid until June 2, 2014. The aircraft had been manufactured on May 29, 2002, and had accumulated a relatively modest service history with no significant technical problems. Whatever had happened to Flight 370, it hadn't been caused by a catastrophic system failure or design flaw. The report's most chilling conclusion was that the diversion from the planned route after waypoint Igeri was difficult to attribute to anomalous system issues alone. The evidence pointed toward deliberate action. Someone had manually turned off communication systems, programmed new waypoints into the flight management computer, and guided the aircraft on its mysterious journey into the southern Indian Ocean. But the investigators couldn't determine whether this intervention had come from inside the cockpit or from external forces. Multiple theories emerged to fill the void left by official uncertainty, each supported by fragments of evidence, but contradicted by others. The pilot suicide hypothesis gained traction among some investigators who noted that Captain Zaharia Hamad Shah had practiced flying similar routes on his home flight simulator, including paths that ended in the southern Indian Ocean. But supporters of this theory couldn't explain why such an experienced pilot would choose such an elaborate method, or why he would continue flying for hours rather than ending the flight quickly. The hijacking theory seemed plausible given the systematic way communication systems had been disabled, but it failed to account for the aircraft's ultimate destination in one of the most remote areas on Earth. Traditional hijackers seek publicity, political leverage, or safe haven, none of which existed in the empty waters where Flight 370 had apparently ended its journey. Fire aboard the aircraft, possibly originating from the lithium-ion battery cargo, offered another explanation for the communication failures and course deviation. Pilots facing an electrical emergency would logically turn toward the nearest suitable airport, which might explain the westward turn toward Kuala Lumpur. But this theory couldn't account for the aircraft's continued flight for hours after the initial emergency, or why standard emergency procedures weren't followed. The hypoxia scenario suggested that a gradual loss of cabin pressure had incapacitated the crew and passengers, leaving the aircraft to fly on autopilot until fuel exhaustion. This ghost flight theory explained the long duration of the flight and the lack of further radio communications, but it struggled to account for the deliberate-seeming actions taken to disable communication systems and alter the flight path. Even more exotic theories proliferated in online forums and social media. Claims that the aircraft had been shot down and covered up. Suggestions that it had landed at the Diego Garcia military base. Elaborate conspiracies involving government agencies and international politics. The Netflix documentary series MH370, The Plane That Disappeared in 2023, amplified many of these alternative narratives, though official investigations found no credible evidence supporting conspiracy theories. The human element remained the most haunting aspect of the mystery. Investigators had scrutinized the backgrounds of both pilots, finding nothing that suggested suicidal tendencies or extremist connections. Captain Shah's political views were known. He supported opposition parties in Malaysian politics, but political disagreement fell far short of evidence for mass murder. First Officer Hamid was even less suspicious, a young pilot building his career with no apparent motive for catastrophic action. The passenger manifest had been thoroughly investigated, with particular attention paid to the two men traveling on stolen Austrian passports. But Interpol and other intelligence agencies had concluded that the passport theft was unrelated to terrorism. The men were Iranian nationals seeking asylum in Europe using a common smuggling route through Southeast Asia. As the investigation wound down without definitive conclusions, families of the victims faced a unique form of grief: loss without explanation, death without witnesses, tragedy without closure. The absence of definitive answers had created space for every possible theory to flourish, from the plausible to the absurd, each claiming to solve a puzzle that had defeated the world's best investigators. The Malaysian report's acknowledgement that third-party intervention could not be excluded left the door open for future discoveries, but it also represented a profound failure of modern aviation safety systems. In an age where passenger jets were supposed to be continuously monitored and tracked, Flight 370 had simply vanished, taking its secrets into the abyss. But even as official investigations concluded with more questions than answers, new technology and renewed determination were preparing for one final attempt to crack aviation's greatest mystery, a search that would push the boundaries of deep ocean exploration even further than before. In early 2025, 11 years after Flight 370 disappeared into the darkness above the South China Sea, Malaysia announced it was entering negotiations with Ocean Infinity for a new search operation, a tacit admission that aviation's greatest mystery remained unsolved, and that somewhere in the vast expanse of the southern Indian Ocean, the answers still waited in the abyss. The enduring power of this case lies not just in its human tragedy, but in what it revealed about the fundamental vulnerabilities of our interconnected world, how something as massive and monitored as a commercial airliner could simply vanish, leaving behind only digital breadcrumbs and fragments of metal washing up on distant shores. The proposed new search reflects advances in underwater technology that have emerged since the last major effort ended in 2018. Ocean Infinity's latest generation of autonomous underwater vehicles can operate at even greater depths and cover larger areas with enhanced precision, while machine learning algorithms have improved the ability to distinguish aircraft debris from natural seafloor features. The company's previous no-find, no-fee arrangement demonstrated confidence in their technology, a confidence that Malaysia appears ready to test once again. But the renewed search also highlights how much remains unknown about the final hours of Flight 370. Despite analyzing more than 230,000 square kilometers of sea floor, despite recovering dozens of debris pieces from across the Western Indian Ocean, Despite the most comprehensive investigation in aviation history, fundamental questions persist about what happened during those 6 hours of phantom flight. The satellite handshake data, reanalyzed countless times by investigators and independent researchers, continues to suggest the aircraft flew south into the Indian Ocean until fuel exhaustion caused dual engine failure around 8:19 a.m. The automatic log-on sequence that followed the aircraft's final electronic signal indicated that the auxiliary power unit had started desperately attempting to restore power to critical systems as the Boeing began its final descent into the ocean. Yet even the seemingly definitive evidence carries ambiguities. The handshake timings and frequency measurements, while precise, can only establish broad arcs of possible locations rather than specific coordinates. Ocean current modeling used to predict where debris might wash ashore has proven more art than science, with actual discovery locations sometimes differing significantly from computer predictions. The human cost of this enduring mystery extends far beyond the immediate families of the 239 victims. The disappearance of Flight 370 exposed critical gaps in global aviation tracking systems, leading to new international requirements for aircraft position reporting over remote areas. The assumption that large aircraft could always be found quickly proved tragically false, spurring development of new technologies designed to prevent another vanishing. Modern aircraft now carry enhanced flight tracking systems. Satellite-based position reporting occurs more frequently over oceanic routes, and emergency locator technologies have been improved to prevent the battery failures that rendered Flight 370's rescue beacons useless. Yet these advances, while significant, represent responses to the previous mystery rather than guarantees against future ones. The broader implications reach into fundamental questions about human nature and technological systems. If Flight 370 was indeed diverted deliberately, as the evidence suggests, it demonstrates how sophisticated safety systems designed to prevent accidents can be vulnerable to intentional misuse. The same technologies that make modern aviation extraordinarily safe, automated systems, redundant communications, precise navigation, can become tools for those seeking to exploit them. The case has also revealed the limitations of our surveilled world. Despite satellites tracking every corner of Earth, despite radar systems monitoring major shipping routes, despite the digital footprints left by every electronic device, Flight 370 found gaps in the global surveillance network, large enough to swallow a Boeing 777 for hours. The aircraft's journey across Malaysia and into the Indian Ocean occurred in spaces between radar coverage areas, in regions where military and civilian tracking systems couldn't maintain continuous contact. As investigators prepare for what may be the final search effort, they face a sobering reality. Even with the most advanced technology available, success is far from guaranteed. The southern Indian Ocean remains one of the most challenging environments on Earth for underwater operations, with extreme depths, violent weather, and seafloor terrain that can hide aircraft wreckage from even the most sophisticated sensors. The families of those aboard Flight 370 continue to live with an absence that defies closure. Unlike other aviation disasters, where crash sites provide final answers and opportunities for mourning, MH370 has left behind only questions and the slim hope that future technology might finally reveal what happened in those dark hours over the Indian Ocean. If the new search succeeds, it would provide not just answers about Flight 370, but validation that human determination and advancing technology can eventually solve even the most baffling mysteries. If it fails, it may represent the final chapter in the most extensive search operation in human history, a search that pushed the boundaries of deep ocean exploration, but ultimately could not recover the secrets that lie beneath miles of dark water. The mystery of Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 remains aviation's greatest unsolved case, a reminder that in our age of total surveillance and instant communication, it is still possible for something to disappear so completely that it challenges everything we thought we knew about the modern world. The ocean keeps its secrets well, and somewhere in the abyss, 239 souls wait for someone to finally bring them home. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even stranger. Subscribe before it drops.